Hi, this is Kelly. You're listening to Vote Her In, a collaboration between Two Broads Talking Politics and author Rebecca Sive, where we look at the movement to elect our first woman president. Hey everyone, this is Vote Her In, which is a series of Two Broads Talking Politics, a collaboration with author Rebecca Sive. And today, instead of a special guest like we often have, we're going to do sort of a wrap-up of the year. It's the final episode of the year and a look ahead to next year. So I am joined in this by my Two Broads co-host, Sophie. Hey, Sophie.
Hey, friends.
And we are also, of course, joined by our partner in this venture, Rebecca Sive. Hello, Rebecca.
Hi there.
So I am going to turn this over to Rebecca now to talk about some of the topics that we're going to discuss on this episode.
So, hello, everybody. Delighted to be here with you after this wonderful year together with Two Broads and with Sophie and Kelly on this mission to inspire, motivate, talk about voting in more women, and particularly a woman president. We debated just before we started the show whether we should lead with a discussion of wine caves, but we've decided that we didn't really learn about wine caves until late last night, and what we did learn about in the course and get to think about, and you all got to think about during the course of the year, were some amazing lessons and inspirational stories from the women we have interviewed. So our thought was, I'm going to just run through some big ideas that, at least for me, were very meaningful in the course of the year's episodes. And then we're going to have a discussion about those, and Kelly and Sophie will give their thoughts. And then we'll have a brief look into next year and what it may herald, and wish you all a wonderful new year and happy holidays after that. So, as you may all have gathered, I'm sort of on the big idea front as a personal matter. I love advocacy and inspirational efforts. So when I was thinking about these big ideas, one of the very first that came to me as a longtime pro-choice advocate is the fact that we heard expressed over and over an unwavering commitment to reproductive rights. And notably, back in June or so, we interviewed both Senator Klobuchar and Senator Gillibrand, and on the side had a brief exchange with Senator Warren. But in both of those longer interviews, just such a clear, compelling commitment to the notion of reproductive rights, which we don't take lightly, I'm sure you don't, and is notable in this year when we face some real barriers to Roe v. Wade still being the law of the land. Of course, the whole voter-in concept, part of what's behind that is the notion of increasing women's executive political power in addition to their legislative power. And as a strategy, electing a woman president, of course, but we also saw and had a discussion about executive political power in a variety of institutional contexts. So, for instance, we talked with Jill Wine-Banks, noted MSNBC commentator, about that in her work. We talked about it with Jan Schakowsky, Congresswoman from Illinois, as a leader of the House of Representatives. We, of course, talked about it with Senators Klobuchar and Gillibrand. Importantly, we talked about it with Illinois State Senator Toy Hutchinson as head of an important national organization of legislators, now an executive in the office of the governor here in Illinois. And also notably, we talked about this notion of executive power and how women may exert it with Ambassador Eartha Cousin, the past head of the World Food Program. And in that context, we got this chance to hear from and explore and just be so grateful for, in my view, the bold, sometimes scary truth-telling on the part of some of the women we interviewed, really all of them, but two stories in particular of interviewees stood out for me. One was the story of Anna Valencia, who is a leader and an official here in the city of Chicago. And the second was from Corinne Jean-Pierre, also a commentator on television, author, and leader of Move On. And in that context, we saw, notwithstanding all the barriers that women face who seek to engage in public life or in politics, we also saw that dreams can come true. And I think that's important for us as we're in post-impeachment days looking to what may happen in the U.S. Senate. And notably, I come back again to Ambassador Cousin and her story of growing up as a young woman in a poor community on the west side of Chicago, and then 50 years later on the world stage as a leader of the UN. We also, in the context of, looking at what young women need to think about, may already be thinking about, may already be doing, we had a great interview with Ann Moses, I should say Dr. Ann Moses, who was the founder of Ignite, and which trains, as you may know, young women to enter politics. And she reported on a recent survey and also some anecdotal evidence, but on the fact of young women are really committed to politics, to policy change, for instance, on climate matters. And I guess last but not least, and I know there are other ideas, but these are the ones, as I said, that jump to mind for me. We were reminded from time to time, certainly by watching the news and seeing what's happening, that women candidates, just like women activists and women elected officials, recognize that we are bending toward justice, as Dr. King talked about. We don't know how long it's going to take, but we need to stay committed. And Linda Hirschman, a great author of several books about women leaders, made that point to us in her interview. So I throw those out for us to think about as the year moves on, and turn to Kelly and Sophie for their thoughts.
Yeah, I wanted to sort of pick up on where you started with the idea of reproductive rights, reproductive justice, and I think that whether it's because women are in the mix in the presidential race or because there are so many women activists pushing it, it's clearly something that the male candidates, too, feel that they need to be all in on the Democratic side on reproductive rights. We saw women activists earlier in the year pushing Joe Biden to say that he would get rid of the Hyde Amendment, which he, clearly was reluctant to do. And so I think having women on the stage, in the debates, having women out there giving speeches on the campaign trail is important, and not just because they are going to tackle these issues if they are elected, but because they are making sure these issues are front and center and that all of the candidates have to be talking about them. And I think that's going to be really crucial moving forward. And we're seeing that not just in the presidential race, of course, we're seeing that in all the congressional races and things too. But I think that's so important in this presidential race.
I will say I've been a little disappointed by the lack of focus on reproductive rights in the debates. Sometimes it comes up every once in a while, but it doesn't seem to have the same sort of sticking power as some of the other issues. It just sort of every once in a while in a debate will come up for 2 or 3 candidates. And I would really like to see the kind of focus on reproductive rights that the debate moderators seem to be putting on healthcare, for example, where we have to have the same healthcare debate every single time. Maybe one of those times instead we could have had discussion of reproductive rights, because as much as, all of the candidates, like most Americans, support Roe v. Wade remaining intact, that's not the only issue, right? Like, I'd like to hear what they want to do about funding. I'd like to hear more about how they would like to get rid of the Hyde Amendment and sort of how they would spread abortion access, across the country, what they would do for states where they have made abortion very, very difficult to get. Is there going to be any sort of federal programs to help those people? I'd like to hear more about that on the debate stage, and I feel like the moderators haven't always given me that.
I think they are starting to make a little more clear this relationship between climate change and its effects on race and gender, how people who are marginalized are going to feel the effects more. They're not drawing that distinctly as much with reproductive rights and really spinning it to reproductive justice in a way that I think is important, and that's what you're getting at, Sophie. And I think, that having, although I love having fewer people on the debate stage, I'm not going to lie, I think getting to this point where there are fewer and where, unfortunately, the really top candidates are white and largely male means that there's even fewer opportunities for that. People like Kamala Harris, people like Julian Castro are talking in those terms, but their voices aren't in the mix anymore, at least on the debate stage. And so, it's not going as far as it could and should, but it's certainly going further than we saw 4 years ago.
Yeah, I think that partially goes back to that idea that, there is this arc that bends toward justice. I think it also may go back to the idea, and this is something we'll be looking at in the coming year as well, about whether, so to speak, it's a women's issue and therefore subsidiary to broader policy and issue matters, or whether, so to speak, every issue is a women's issue and, to your point, Sophie, deserves equal time. And I think that's a challenge for us. It was a challenge and will be one.
I think that, one of the other things that I want to come back to, tease out a little bit, is this idea of executive political power and electability more largely. That's a term that's been thrown around a lot this year. What is electability? It seems to be sort of the thing people care most about, but no one can define it. And it, ends up meaning looking like the person who's been in the job before. And I think that, we're starting to see all of the candidates in the presidential election finally try to make the case a little more about why they are the electable one. That wasn't something they were focusing on as much before, and they're all drawing these distinctions, and seeing someone like Warren, who is not making that distinction in terms of gender, but is saying, I've tackled corruption, I have lots of plans for corruption, we're going against the most corrupt president administration we've ever seen. That's the distinction we need to make. And, I think it's interesting that really none of the women have ever tried to say, the distinction, the reason that I'm electable is because I'm a woman. But I think that, sometimes there are people making the argument the other way, saying to the men, are you electable this year? It's a year of a woman, like women are the ones winning all the races in Congress and in down ballot. Can a white man win this year? And so that I think that's an interesting, I don't think that's necessarily getting, down to all the voters. I think that's just something that sort of the media elite is talking about, but I think it's a really interesting spin.
I agree with you, and I kind of noticed this yesterday as part of the debate where there was a moment where Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar were sort of at loggerheads.
Right.
And Pete Buttigieg kept coming back to, I'm a millennial and I'm gay and I was elected in Indiana. And Amy Klobuchar did not counter with, well, I'm a woman and that makes me really electable in the Democratic Party. She just started talking about her policies. And so I think it's really interesting that no one has made the explicit electability argument. And I'm thinking it's probably because in 2016 our candidate was a woman and she lost.
Well, but she won, but
well, she won. You're right. I mean, she won, exactly. But she lost the Electoral College. And I think that people are taking the wrong lesson from that sometimes. I think they're saying, oh, well, that proves that a woman can't win the presidency. And what it proves is that a lot of women thought we had it in the bag and became very angry when she was not elected and were motivated to do things like win back the House in 2018 and are still motivated. And so that was less of a proof in the pudding moment when Hillary Clinton lost as a catalyst for women to become more involved in politics. And so I really wish people would make that electability argument more and say, most of the people who have really energized the party post 2016 are women. So maybe they would be even more excited to vote in 2020 by a female candidate.
Well, and most of the people who vote as Democrats are women.
Yes.
Yeah, that's completely true. I also think it may be a more gradual process than, for instance, the three of us would hope. But both Elizabeth Warren and Amy Klobuchar in the last couple of weeks have made greater note of the fact of a woman's candidacy and a woman's value. Amy had a broadly, so to speak, referenced quote about, can a woman beat Donald Trump? Yes, Nancy Pelosi does it every day, which has resonated in a lot of places. And, of course, Elizabeth Warren also talked about, well, why not have two women on the ticket? So I think you're right. There may not be at this moment in time a full-throated, yes, let's elect a woman because we did it once, let's really do it again, which is, of course, the argument in my book, Vote Her In. But perhaps as the year unfolds, we'll see more, to your point.
You mentioned also this idea of bold storytelling, sometimes scary truth-telling. I think that we're seeing a lot of the women candidates. I feel like they are leaning in more to that, and and not just at the presidential level. We saw that a ton in 2018 in congressional races. Women talking a lot about health struggles in their family that was motivating them to run, for instance. And I think a lot of us feel that if Hillary Clinton, that she sort of famously is kind of closed off, it doesn't feel as warm and fuzzy sometimes. And I think when she did at the convention in 2016 talk some about her family, about how she grew up, about, the motivation that she got from that, I thought it was really compelling. And, for a lot of reasons, women don't always lean into that. But I think, we do see that more. Certainly Warren leans into her family story a lot. Anyone who's listened to her stump speech more than once can tell you all about the dress that her mom had on when she was going to go get a job because her dad had a heart attack. And, so we see that. Amy Klobuchar talks a lot about her dad, especially in battles with addiction. Definitely, we saw Kamala talking a lot about, growing up. There was that famous debate moment where she said, I was that little girl on the bus,
Right.
And so I think maybe they are starting to realize, men have always done this, of course, but I feel like, and this may just be anecdotal, but it feels like women were less willing to sort of tell their personal stories, less willing to sort of go there. And in an era of Me Too, when people are talking so much more about personal stories, talking about how that motivates them, the work that they're doing, and it really feels like the women are starting to open up more in that way. And it's especially clear because of the comparison with Hillary Clinton. But I think that's really valuable, and I think it will help quite a bit in voters relating to women candidates the way that they relate to men candidates.
On that point, when I was listening to the post-debate analysis last night, there was this, talking heads of three white guys, which, by the way, no surprise, was driving me crazy. But I did hear one of those oh-so-wise guys say, yes, what voters really want to hear is stories, right? Not policy positions. And I think you're right that when people open up and really share those stories, as our interviewees did, all of whom are major public figures, right? But not afraid to tell the story of, this is what I did, this is how scary it was, this is, how and when I went for it. And, going back to people like Anna Valencia, for instance, who grew up in and Earthrin Cousin, very modest circumstances. Here they are on the world stage. So there is proof to that. I think you're right, Kelly.
It's not just in politics, too. I mean, I know I was given advice, sort of in the working world of not talking too much about family and raising kids and things like that. And I've frankly ignored that advice quite a bit. But I think you can't make changes in the way people see the world. If women in the working world are completely unwilling to talk about the challenges they face raising kids, and then nothing changes, and you have to be able to talk about those things. And the same with, getting women's issues on the political stage. You have to talk about it. If no one understands how devastating a rape can be to a 20-year-old, then you need to be talking about that so people understand.
Yeah. Well, I would just point out on the positive side of this, a little story from my own past, which just goes to the point we're discussing, where many years ago when I was asked to run for public office, and several times, including for Congress, and I was told, well, yeah, you'd be a great candidate. You know how to talk to people. You know how to organize. Why don't you think about it? But if you're going to think about it seriously, you have to have children. And when I tell that story today, people's mouths drop open, right? That had to be a part of the story, that you're a mother too, right? So there's another side to this, which of course women have to be really careful about, which I saw the other day, and I think it was a piece in the Times about young women candidates having to be careful about their use of social media, right? How much truth-telling, how much storytelling, how much sort of unvarnished truth you share with, others as you run, or as you consider being a leader, whether it's, running or appointed or doing what we're doing.
Well, and you see the example of Katie Hill being punished far more than any man in a similar situation.
Right. Exactly.
Well, perhaps we should switch gears now and sort of look ahead, talk toward the future. So, Rebecca, you had some ideas about things that we should focus on.
Yeah, I was, some of this stuff, and of course all of you know this, is a kind of constant. There are constant themes and facts that we as women activists and women who care have to be cognizant of. But there were a few thoughts that I thought particularly we learned so much about from our interviews and our other discussions that I wanted to share as we look ahead and for us to discuss. One is the fact that regardless of whether you're a woman or a man, you got to get more votes, you got to get more money, you got to get more endorsements than the next person. That while being a woman is still special, if not unique in the political world, then the votes are going to get counted. And even in face of the fact that discrimination against women is, as we've just discussed in the case of Katie Hill, a constant. And related to that is the fact that any woman who steps out there, certainly on the presidential stage, as I think Kamala Harris saw and Kirsten Gillibrand saw, is going to be subject to, from time to time, if not too frequently, from time to time, unequal treatment by the media. And so what I was thinking about is, for those of us who are supporting the notion of electing a woman president and more women in public office, is the need for each of us to, so to speak, monitor the media. And we're going to have to do that assiduously in 2020. It's just so easy for it to run in the other direction. And I just want to quickly point to one example from, again, the post-debate discussion last night, when I heard one of these guys say, well, it was white women who caused Hillary Clinton to lose. And no, it wasn't. An overwhelming majority of white men voted for Mr. Trump. And then, yes, there were a substantial number of white women who voted for him as well, but many fewer. And it was just this sort of lazy analysis that needs to be called out. A couple more ideas that I really thought about, watching for whether, and we touched on this a moment ago, whether, women, so to speak, women's issues, whether it's reproductive rights or equal pay or other matters, will, so to speak, play in the arena as Sophie was expressing, or whether, no, we have to talk broadly and mention, so to speak, women's issues as sort of subsidiary. And then, in that context, whether if one or more of the two women who are still in the race and Iowa are able to go on to New Hampshire with some wind at their backs, whether they will be able to do so, notwithstanding the fact that they will be the first ever in American history to do that, and what they will face. And then, I guess last, of course, and we'll sort of cheer ourselves on at the end of the podcast, we must remember, it seems to me, as we go into 2020, that each of us is equally important and valuable in this context of civic life and public engagement and political change, and that we each have a very special role as a messenger, as an organizer, as a leader, as a voice. So those are the things that sort of captured my mind as I was looking at our the episodes of the past year.
I think to this point of the media, one of the good things about this past year, and that I assume will continue in 2020, is parts of the media calling out the sexism, having think pieces on what is likability, what is electability, and sometimes, the same piece is written like 25 times. But I think it is good that people are pushing back. There are terrific writers out there like Sadie Doyle who pushes back on this stuff constantly, so I think that is something that we really did not see enough of in 2016. There was very clear sexism and very little recognition of the sexism in the coverage. And while it's still happening this time, at least there are people who are recognizing it and trying to push back and reframe things a little bit.
Right.
Yeah, I agree. And I think one thing that came out of the surprise of 2016 for many people, I wasn't that surprised, but I was somewhat surprised, was that there were a lot of postmortems of the campaigns, and there's a lot of sort of public discussion of the media's role in sort of treating Hillary Clinton in sexist ways. And I think the media have been forced to sort of overall kind of grapple with their role in electing Donald Trump. And I think that some people in some areas of the media have been trying really deliberately to not do that this time around. Other people in the media are just never going to accept that they have this responsibility. But I have seen a substantial number of reporters and newsrooms try consciously to learn lessons from 2016, which I think is admirable.
Yeah, they're not completely successful, of course, even when they try. And we all have built-in biases, and, that is underplaying some of it, and where gender intersects with race. There were clearly ways that Kamala was portrayed, for instance, that, had some bias in the way that she was portrayed. But, I think it's better. We're at least on the right track. And so that's a positive step.
Maybe the question is, how can we speed up the train going down that track, right? To follow on your metaphor, I think it's. I've said it just now, but I just continue to be distressed at the unequal presentation of women of all kinds in the context in which millions and millions of people are, looking at what's going on. But we did have an all-woman interview panel, I think, at one of the debates, and that was something I don't think any of us could have imagined just, a couple of years ago.
Yeah, I think speeding it up is hard. And one of the things I'm thinking about a lot is sort of the really long view. So Sophie and I are both raising young sons, and so we're thinking very deliberately about how we talk to them about gender. And, it's not enough that just my kids see that I'm a woman who is, successful in doing things, but I talk to them about it and, talk to them about gender and how there's never been a woman president. It's important that we have women. And so I think, that's, of course, not going to pay off for decades, but I think there are a lot of us who are doing that now, and that will be important moving forward.
For sure. I would say on this point and the point I was raising about, so to speak, women's issues as opposed to every issue is a woman's issue, that one of the things I find interesting in this context and going forward is the continuing use of some of the more radical notions about change, about trying to speed it up, images of, so to speak, smash the patriarchy. And I have to say, I take some art from that.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And, although Gillibrand's campaign did not do as well as I would have hoped, I think she was so outspoken about the role of gender in everything, and the way that we need to have more women in the arena. And I really, I wish that it had gotten more traction, and there's lots of reasons that it didn't. But I think it's important, even when, she isn't ultimately elected president, that we just hear those voices, that message is getting out there deliberately and consistently.
And on that point, going to this last theme that I mentioned a few minutes ago, I think one of I continue to see this, that, notwithstanding the incredible activism among women, by millions of women we've seen since the Women's March in 2017, there is still this feeling, I get this sometimes when I talk to people or give a speech, that, well, what can I do, right? And I think that, certainly both you and Sophie are wonderful examples of women who were energized and became quite active and helpful and important in that process. But I do want to perhaps, end our discussion with this fact that we each are so important in this. And I wanted to just kick it off by one idea which really resonates with me and I've found resonates with other women, and that is the notion that women talking to each other, right? And then sort of engaging, the three of us and 5 other girlfriends are having a conversation, and we talk about these issues and how can we elect the next woman president. And in that conversation, what we also commit to doing, for instance, is each of us talking to another 7 women, right? Mm-hmm. And thereby just spreading the word. You don't need any money to do this. You don't even need a cell phone to do this. You just get together and do it, spreading the word, and each of us being a unique messenger.
Yeah, I think a lot about how at the end of the 2016 campaign, right before the election, women sort of all finally came together, but we're only willing to do it in secret Facebook groups, and how much that has changed. That, I was not quiet about my support for Hillary Clinton, but I also wasn't very in your face about it. And now I'm so much more likely to engage in those debates and talk about why electing a woman is important, why it's important to me, not back down when people say, well, shouldn't we just elect the best person regardless of gender? Which is, anyway,
yeah, right.
that I think a lot of us are more willing to push back on that, both online, but also in person, and have those conversations. I've talked very deliberately with my father, for instance, about who I think is the best candidate and why, and, why I think that the candidate he's supporting, might not be the right choice, and in ways that I wasn't having those conversations before. And I think that if all of us do that, that goes a really long way.
It's a sort of, the other thing about it is in this age of, here's Mike Bloomberg and Tom Steyer, for instance, spending tens of millions of dollars on paid advertising. We are an equal counterweight to that, and I think we women, and I think sometimes we forget that the people that each of us listens to most carefully as the people we know, right? And then the people who are in the public eye, who, going back to what we were talking about a minute ago, tell the stories that we're familiar with too, and how they went about achieving as they did. And I think that that's something I might be repeating it ad nauseum in the new year, who knows, given all the money that's likely to be spent, including by the women candidates. But I do want to say that, if anything, the interviews we did this past year, the other discussions we had, the sort of historical context in which we placed this amazing time we're in about women running for president, is all about individual women stepping up, speaking out. And there was perhaps close with this idea. When I was at the 2017 Women's March and photographing it, and which was what really impelled me to write Vote Her In, there was the signs. And one of those signs, I talk about it in the book, it said, history has its eyes on us, right? And so that's kind of where we are. We have eyes on us. We have our own eyes on us. We have this capacity, to be incredible agents for change. So as we're looking ahead to next year and all the discussion we're going to have, I want us to just bear in mind that even on the dark days, that's what we're going to be able to do. Remember that we have the power.
I love that line about history has its eyes on us. I feel like that's such a hopeful thing when things are bad, to think, but future generations will look back on this and see that we did the right thing, that things were incredibly difficult. That makes me think of my grandparents during the civil rights movement, and how proud I've always been to look back and think it wasn't popular then, but thinking about them going door to door to register Black voters in the South makes me very proud. And so it's nice to think that maybe my child or my grandchildren will feel that way about me.
Exactly.
And if Sophie and I can go out and canvass, knock doors, and tell people to vote, then anyone can do it.
Oh my God.
So in 2020, everybody sort of push yourself outside your comfort zone, whatever that means for you, and really step up, because it will take all of us doing it. But I believe that we can fix the direction of this country and really make change if we all step up and do it.
You guys, I'm such an introvert and I have an anxiety disorder, and I have canvassed many times now. So if I can do it, the trick is just to ask if you can have a buddy. And for some reason, having a buddy makes you feel much safer and much better, because then you have somebody to decompress with between houses. So just ask for a buddy and it'll be fun, and just go out and do it.
And on that note, I think we're going to close this last edition of the Voter In podcast. I just want to say to all our listeners that it's really been a great joy to me, for me, to partner with Sophie and Kelly on this. I feel that not only can any of us do it regardless of where we are, say, in our personal comfort zone, that coming together across the generations on these common issues is just a joy. So I want to wish everyone a happy new year and tell you that we're already in the works planning for a wonderful new Voter In year, and I'm hoping you all will join us.
Indeed. Thank you. Happy New Year.
The Vote Her In segment is a collaboration of Two Broads Talking Politics and author Rebecca Sive. Our theme song is called Are You Listening, off of the album Elephant-Shaped Trees by the band Immunuri, and we're using it with permission of the band. Our logo and other original artwork is by Matthew Weflin and was created for use by this podcast. You can contact us at twobroadstalkingpolitics@gmail.com or on Twitter or Facebook at Two Broads Talk. You can find all of our episodes at twobroadstalkingpolitics.com or anywhere podcasts are found.